Hi, everybody. My name is Saja Davis, and today I'm going to be giving you a presentation on independence. Now, today we'll embark on a journey through a transformative period in the Americas where the echoes of revolution and the pursuit of independence resounded across Latin America. Latin Americans' stability was remarkable. So the story of its collapse was something that many people just couldn't necessarily prepare for. The tale of the destruction of caste systems and the development of the status of mixed race people is something that's going to become all too familiar as we dive into history. Okay, so the next few slides are going to be just a quick brush over summary of the things we're going to be talking about today. Now, I want you to close your eyes and I want you to picture a time in the late 18th century. The people of Spanish America are being ruled by a Spanish king, an incompetent Spanish king at that, Carlos IV. Now, his misrule led to many consequences and expensive conflicts at that, leading to higher taxes and unpopular practices. Now, you can open your eyes because I'm pretty sure that's a place you don't want to be. So, we'll then look at what the book calls the crisis period, which took place from 1805 to 1825. And we'll be able to then recognize our men of color for their acts of bravery. Um, the independence wars gave rise to these unexpected heroes through their acts of bravery, and they became honorary figures and pillars for what the independence wars and movement period embodied, right? So they were willing to do what it took to gain independence, even if that meant their lives. So we'll then observe the aftermath of independence, where the doors were open for violent events that led to independence, focusing on Mexico and Peru, Venezuela and Argentina, and lastly, Brazil. The effects of these wars allow us to witness the birth of constitutional republics and the revolutionary development. And most importantly to me is that the caste systems take a huge hit. Now, for someone like me, a black woman in America, I'm all too familiar with this concept of caste systems, something that you are born into, something that you can't necessarily work your way in and out of. And, it's not achieved, it's ascribed. So the fact that, I was reading it and it took a bit of a hit, I enjoyed reading that. But also, one thing that stood out to me that was an outcome was that individuals of mixed race find newfound status in society. So we'll get deeper into those things a bit later. Okay, so before we dive into the heart of the matter, let's kind of set the stage, right? So, like I said before, colonial rule in Latin America was marked by stability, right? So, this wasn't necessarily something that was foreseen by it just wasn't foreseen, right? So the social hierarchy remained intact and the white elites were at the top. So, the stark contrast with Haiti, where slaves took control, adds complexity to our understanding at the time, right? So we'll get into a little bit later how nativism and liberalization it did excludes slaves. So we'll talk a bit about those things that essentially became the solution to independence. All right, so now let's draw our attention and get more detail. Let's turn our attention to the catalyst, right? So, the grueling rule of the incompetent Spanish king, coupled with bankruptcy and wars, set the stage, right? So, the impact of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars on Spain and Portugal would prove pivotal moments in history. You see, the king left his responsibilities to a hated minister. This misrule was also a pathway towards bankruptcy to the Spanish state during the 1700s, right? This led to many issues. The one that stood out most to me was the sale of high office, right? So this led to people who were obviously wealthy. They were granted the opportunity to buy places in office, right? So they weren't necessarily qualified, they just had money. We see why they were going bankrupt and needed the money, but okay, right? So they're getting this opportunity, and what the book calls incompetent people, like you're giving incompetent people power and leading the way for unpopular government foreclosures of long-term loans. Now, If this wasn't enough, above all of this, the war with England led to the drop of Atlantic sailings, crushing colonial trade. Okay, y'all, there's a lot going on. So, to me, this is so concerning. Not only do our people who are in power not necessarily care about us as people and what's going on, that they allowed these wealthy people to just come and claim our you know, our high offices, but us as people, Spanish Americans, seen no reason to rebel yet. And in fact, as we'll cover later, a lot of Spanish Americans remain loyal to Carlos IV's heir, Prince Fernando. So this to me was just all too concerning. And to be honest, this is what drew me in. All right, so a quick switching of gears to Brazil's journey to independence. It seems to be rather unique, right? So Portugal's friendly ties with England and the upheavals of the revolution, the French Revolution triggered a different path for them. And in addition to this, the fight of the Portuguese royal family to Brazil in 1807 altered the course of history. So what we'll soon learn is that the Portuguese royal family leaving and going to Rio essentially was a push for Brazil's independence, and we'll talk about that a little bit more, but I want to make sure we understand the ideological roots that played into a lot of the independence that's going to go on, period. All right, so the wars themselves were transformative. Beyond the bloodshed, they brought about profound social change and elements of liberalism and nationalism emerged, shaping the political landscape for years to come. So, like I mentioned before, liberal ideologies from France and England played a crucial role in inspiring independence movements. So, the Neopolitic Wars triggered Latin America independence, all under the ideology of popular sovereignty. So, what is popular sovereignty? What is liberalism? And how exactly did they push independence movements? So, to understand the motivations, we must explore the ideological underpinnings, the influence of French Revolution and Enlightenment ideals, particularly liberalism, which played a significant role. In addition to this, popular sovereignty became a guiding principle shaping the course of events. You see, the French revolutionaries of 1790 did not like the idea of divine right, which essentially was where kings became kings because they shared the bloodline of the previous king, the royal bloodline. These revolutionaries' motto stood behind three major principles: liberty, equality, and fraternity, which was in direct correlation with popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty is where the people determine who would rule according to a written constitution. Now, because of these major principles and the want and need for popular sovereignty, these revolutionaries executed Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, the French king and queen. Oh, but they weren't going to stop there. They wanted to overthrow other European kings and establish republics. But of course, the journey won't be easy. Yes, this was an eye opening, jaw dropping strive for independence. But soon enough, this revolutionary dominance would become an ideology, right? So, not just to justify military aggression, French armies led by generals, French council, but for Emperor Napoleon to use as an ideology to begin liberating countries into French control. Take a second. Liberty and liberation. Liberalism from both England and France inspired the Neopolitic Wars. So buckle up. You're going to hear a tale of fallen soldiers, fallen leaders, but they were all willing to do what it took to get what they wanted. And that was independence. Alrighty, so like I said before, Brazil's journey to independence was unique, right? So Portugal's friendly ties with England and the upheavals of the French Revolution triggered a new path in a different direction, right? So, in saying this, I mean the flight of the Portuguese royal family to Brazil to in 1807 altered the course of history. So, wait, what exactly happened? They fled? What? Here's what happened, right? So, in 1807, Portuguese refused to close their gates and declare war on England. So, Napoleon invaded Portugal, causing the Portugal royal family to flee and seek refuge in Brazil. So, wait, Napoleon said, "Oh, you're not going to declare war on England? Well, we're going to declare war on you and your family, and we're going to invade you." So, Prince João, who was the Prince of Portugal at the time, made his royal court in Rio de Janeiro, just barely outside of the reach of Napoleon, right? But nonetheless, Napoleon had imprisoned the Spanish king Carlos IV and his heir Prince Fernando, causing both to essentially forfeit their claims to the Spanish throne, right? So because of this, Napoleon decided to place his brother as the King of Spain, which was a very bad move on his part, right? So the Spanish king's imprisonment fueled the emergence of local juntas in Spanish America. Right. So now, in my opinion, if I was a Spaniard and I was the Spanish Americans, I would be confused, right? Because this idea of popular sovereignty was put in place. This ideology, popular sovereignty, and you know divine right. We don't like divine right, but ironically, you're placing your brother who is in your bloodline in the throne. We didn't choose him. He could very well have been qualified, but from the outside looking in, it just seemed very hypocritical to me, right? It doesn't seem like popular sovereignty. And the Spaniards and the Spanish Americans, they probably would have agreed, coupled with their loyalty to their legitimate queen, to their legitimate king, they refused to accept this, right? So this period was marked by tumultuous events and shifting power dynamics. The French Revolution of 1789 to 1799 and the Neapolitan Wars of 1799 to 1815 shook the foundations of Europe, and more issues arose after this course. So the shockwave of the eclipse of the legitimate monarchy spread through Spanish America, right? Local juntas were formed as Americans rejected foreign rule. So this resistance was both a challenge and an opportunity for change. Now, the local juntas were emerged because most Spanish Americans truly had loyalty towards a legitimate king, the Prince Fernando. They reaffirmed his old ideas that the Spanish king throne had two pillars of support: his European kingdom in Iberia and his American kingdom in the New World, right? But they also rejected the idea that Mexico, Peru, or the New Grandes were colonies. While they were loyal, they weren't willing to forfeit equality, right? It's key to remember that they believed that the American kingdoms were equal to the European ones and not subservient to them, right? So creating the caretaker juntas, who were formed from the open meeting of the town council called the Cabildo Abierto. These juntas were willing to make changes and get things done. It is important that we put in there that in the midst of these events, the Constitution of Cadiz emerged as the beacon of Liberia liberalism. I'm sorry. So this document had the potential to reshape the Spanish empire profoundly. Now, the Spanish its full implementation faced challenges, though, as the anti-Spanish rebellion gained momentum in Latin America. Now, a few contrasts to the Brazil and Spanish America before we jump into the independence aspect was that um, Brazil and Spanish America had two contradicting effects of what was happening during the independence period, right? So in Brazil, stability during the Neocolonic Wars, but in Spanish America, there was shock and resistance. These rejections of the central juntas authority marked a turning point. And this is something that we'll see in a second. So these two people I have on the screen are two of the key dynamic people that we learned in our reading, right? So Miguel Hidalgo and Jose Maria Morales, right? So we'll now dive into the dynamics between Creoles and the Peninsulars, right? So as resentment brewed, who were the initiators of independence? And what were their motives and what were their actions? So often the initiatives of independence came from native born whites called Creoles. Creoles were Spaniards born on the Iberian Peninsula, and Iberian born Spaniards were called peninsulars, other nasty terms, right? So essentially the Creoles were tired of the peninsulars, right? They were like, why do you guys get all the privileges when we were just born in two different places, right? They got everything worth having, but specifically they were preferred agents of imperial rule. Now, ironically, though, the rest of the 4/5 of the nation actually didn't like the Creoles because they were the people who were essentially oppressing the mixed race people, trying to tell them to stay in their place. So while the rest of the Spanish Americans, while they definitely did have a reason to revolt, it just wasn't necessarily against the, peninsulars, right? So let's kind of get into Miguel, right? Miguel Hidalgo was initiated. He was who initiated the revolt. So he was a Creole priest ringing his bell, speaking to an audience, not about independence, but about needing to defend Mexico. It was his belief that Spanish conquerors stole Indian land from Creoles, not the peninsulars of 1810, who descended from the conquerors. Now, he had more in common with the peninsulars, who were his social peers, but he had the issue of Americans versus Europeans. He made it this us versus you type thing instead of, okay, what really is the issue here, right? So he stated, long live the virgins of Guadalupe and death to the Spaniards. See, this phrase from Miguel just about created an all-out war that killed hundreds of peninsulars, but not just peninsulars, Creoles as well. You see, when Miguel's constituents began to expand by thousands, the indigenous people and the mestizo peasants didn't necessarily care who they were killing, right? So when Miguel was giving his speech, he was giving the speech to the people who actually knew what he was talking about, right? They knew what he was talking about, but when other people started joining in, they felt the peninsulars and the Creoles were just as annoying and arrogant. They didn't care who they were killing. So when the people joined in, the Creoles and Miguel specifically didn't anticipate how many people and how many Creoles specifically were going to die. Like he didn't anticipate that. So this was something that the Creoles just didn't foresee. They eventually executed Miguel and many of his constituents, unfortunately, because he didn't plan things out correctly. Now let's get into Jose Maria Morales. So Jose actually wasn't a Creole. He was a mestizo. Now his army was organized, right? So he actually planned them out correctly and had them organized right. But imagine these troops who had a clear main goal of putting an end to slavery, an end to caste systems, and to the tribute paid by indigenous people, right? Jose didn't like caste systems though, right? So he believed that everyone born in America was Americano. So in 1813, he declared independence. And while he didn't attract many Creoles, he definitely didn't end up executed like Miguel. His troops were actually making a stride towards breaking down colonial rule. Now, this brings me to the point of nativism, right? And what exactly does nativism show us, right? Now, nativism became like a winning, became, I'm sorry, y'all. Sorry. So nativism emerged as the winning strategy for Creoles, right? Let's talk about it. What is one thing that joins everyone together? Creoles, indigenous people, mixed race people, and even the children of African slaves. Birthplace. Who knew it would be so simple, right? So Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina each defined theirs as the American cause, right? And their enemies were anyone born in Spain and Portugal. See, the term of Americano symbolized unity between these countries, underlying the common enemy and address the controversial struggles of the century, right? So such resentment against the idea of colonial inferiority, but specifically resentment against Spain and Portugal, who were now foreigners in the new native eyes, right? It combined the idea of liberalism and the liberal ideology in obvious ways. People govern and the people are Americanos. Now, through the Creoles, this idea, see, through and through, the Creoles wanted to see the social hierarchy shift to where they were equal to the peninsulars, not necessarily to where there was true social equality. So they had planned to milk this, they were planning to milk this Americano native thing until they were the leaders of the emerging nations. Okay, so of course, I didn't forget about who I keep mispronouncing his name. I'm sorry. Junto and his royal court. So meanwhile, the impact of the royal court in Rio de Janeiro on in Brazil's society was pretty great. They loved him and he loved it. Like everything was going amazing and it just seemed to be great. Of course, we're going to touch a little bit more on him, but let's get back into the challenges of Peru. Now, why was the Peruvian Creoles' approach to independence so cautious? Right? What was going on here? So creating nations from scratch is something that is so challenging, right? This isn't like building a cake from scratch where everything just magically goes together. You are putting diverse populations lacking shared identity and patriot leaders face this daunting task, right? So uniting people with little in common, this was a struggle not just for the battlefield, but it was also in the realm of imagination, right? See, the Peruvian Creoles were scared, right? They had already gotten a taste of this medicine when they tried to rebel in 1780s when Tupac Amaru II rebelled, right? They knew better than to mess with the peninsulars after that. Now, when they did get involved, this would be on behalf of their loyalty towards Fernando VII. Or Creoles would engage in fights, but typically no change would occur from that, right? Often these indigenous people as a whole preferred to be left out. Peru and other Andean areas such as Bolivia and Ecuador continued to be under Spanish control, even as major revolts continued elsewhere. The leading Creoles and the French colonies, such as Venezuela and Argentina, were less cautious. They just dislike the unfair trading restrictions that favored the silver production in the core areas of Peru and Mexico. They didn't like it. They were going to do what they wanted, and they sure did. Alrighty, so now the Patriots Dontes of Caracas and Buenos Aires began as Quimbendos okay, I'm sorry if I pronounced this wrong, but it was essentially town councils, right? This group was led by well-known, confident Creoles, and many of them witnessed some of the European events firsthand. So you can imagine they knew what mistakes not to make, right? They put aside their loyalty towards King Fernando to focus on liberation. They wanted the full independence and they were willing to do so at any cost. See, in Venezuela, they weren't new to the game, they were confused on the game, right? They had already experienced these things in 1811. They needed to figure out how to make it stick and how to make real change. Here I do introduce you to Enaros, the men who were willing to cause uproar at any moment of any time because they wanted real change. These were men who ate nothing but beef and rode horses better than they could talk. Now, they didn't like um the sorry, they didn't like the plantation owning revolutionary carcasses because they disliked them and viewed them as scum because they shifted towards King Fernando and the you know I'm sorry, I'm getting overwhelmed. Um since the carcass was kind of shifting away from King Fernando, the Aneros, they were willing to do anything for their king. All the while in Argentina, the revolutionary junta had a much easier time gaining military assistance, right? You see, it all started in 1806 and 1807, where the Spanish and the British were enemies. Both the British experienced um, okay, I'm sorry. So you see, it all started in 1806 and 1807, where the Spanish and the British were enemies. Both British expeditions of Rio de la Plata were defeated, but not by the peninsular forces. Instead, it was by local militia. Right. I know you see where I'm going with this. This event played right into the hands of Creole patriots because they had the upper hand militarily. When Spain's Neapolitan crisis started, finally in May 1810, peninsular control had ended once and for all in Buenos Aires. However, other regions of Rio de Plantas weren't necessarily interested in gaining that same control, causing Buenos Aires and Rio de la Plata to fight and cause an internal war. How devastating, right? Imagine feeling like you've reached the end. You're now having to fight the people who should have been searching for the same independence as you. But by 1815, Peru was still in control by the Spanish American independence was dwindling, and the Patriots still had yet to get enough people on their side. However, let's switch gears to Brazilian independence. So, like I said, Brazilian independence was a lot different. Now, Junto, the sixth, things started to get kind of expensive where he was at, right? And Spanish speaking neighbors ensued in war on the Brazilian southern border. Of course, Junto wasn't looking to have his family flee again, so he caved in to the British pressure and legally restricted slave trade. Now, we all know slave owners didn't like that. Yeah, I know. I know British ships once participated in slave trade heavily, but they renounced that practice and pressured other nations to do the same. And it was their goal to have the slave owners now, I mean, not the slave owners, have the slave owners and the slaves now as customers of their British goods. Changing gears a little bit, liberal republicanism, put simply, favored majority of Brazilians, right? And liberalism wasn't something that was widely familiar. Therefore, the revolt of 1817 was shut down fairly quickly by Junto's forces arriving in Pernambuco to put an end to it, right? Nonetheless, Portuguese actions surely did push Brazil closer to independence in 1820. Through and through, the people of Lisbon missed their king and had hopes for his return back in 1815 when Napoleon was defeated. Let's note, however, that the assembly wasn't too fond of Junot's 1815 declaration raising Brazil from legal status of colony to kingdom, making it equal to Portugal. Now, I want to reiterate that Junto knew that, independence for Brazil was possibly inevitable. So he had a little plan under his sleeve. He wanted Brazil to be intact, but he still wanted to be in the grasp of his family, his royal family. So he left his son behind. By leaving his son behind, they were able to not only declare independence by 1822, by 1823, but they were able to keep it in the royal family because he knew that the assembly just didn't necessarily want the Portuguese to, didn't necessarily want the Brazil to be its own colony. So he said, all right, if there's going to be a war, at least there will be a king here and a king there, right? So Pedro, which was Junto's son, successfully was able to create a monarchy with him as the monarch, right? By the end of 1823, the Brazilian party had finally achieved their goal of independence while simultaneously painting the social hierarchy, keeping the slave-owning elite in charge. Even the liberal junta started to accept the proposition of now Pedro I, Emperor of Brazil. This embodied the cause of Brazilian patriotism. As we conclude, let's ponder on the contrasting outcomes between Spanish America and Brazil. Let's reflect on the role of nativism in shaping the independence movement and the enduring impact of the nations, right? Let's understand the leaders that happened and let's understand everything that went on. To me, the thing that stood out most to me was Junto's intuition of what would happen, right? He felt that the Portuguese weren't necessarily going to be comfortable with having Brazil as its own colony. So he knew his people and he set forth a plan to have everything go the right way, if that makes sense. And that essentially was the push that Brazil needed. So thank you so much for listening to my presentation. I apologize for the stuttering at the end. I recorded this so many times. Thank you.